Hello, everyone. Tonight, I've got a batch of chilling tales to share with you. But before we dive in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me keep creating even better content. Now, sit back, relax, and join me as we embark on this eerie journey together. I still remember the day I first met Mr. Caldwell. It was the second week of my senior year, and I'd heard rumors about the strict new English teacher at Harper High, how he demanded silence in his classroom beyond even what the school handbook allowed. When I cracked open the door on that damp September morning, a cold draft slipped in with me, carrying the faint scent of chalk and something musky like old paper. He stood at the blackboard, tall and thin, his back to us, as he wrote in precise looping script. Every stroke of the chalk sounded like a whispered hiss. When he finally turned around, his face was pale, almost translucent, save for two cold dark eyes that seemed to bore right through me. "I expect excellence," he said, voice low and measured. "And I insist on attention." He tapped the board 3 times. Today, the haunting of Bly Manor. We begin our study of Gothic literature. I sat in the 3rd row, directly beneath a small air vent. Throughout the lesson, the vent rattled softly, spewing a faint, chilling breeze that seemed to caress my neck. Whenever I looked up, Mr. Caldwell would catch me staring, and the room would warp around me. For a second, desks bending, curtains swaying though no windows were open. That afternoon, he announced a unique assignment. Each student must write a personal confession, something you've never told another soul, and turn it in by Friday. Then each confession would be read aloud in class. I swallowed hard. This was more than an English lesson. It felt like a summons into his private shadows. Over the next few days, I struggled with what to write. I'm a quiet kid, few secrets. Still, I scribbled my confession on thin yellowed paper I'd cheated on the math final last spring. I folded it twice, sealed it in an envelope, and handed it to him before the bell rang on Monday. As we shuffled into class, the lights flickered twice, a precursor I would learn to every reading. Mr. Caldwell stood at his desk, the pile of envelopes on display like a grotesque card deck. He picked one at random, slid it open with a silver letter opener that gleamed unnaturally, and began to read in that soft voice, his tone mocking and reverent all at once. I watched as his lips formed my words. When he reached the part about the calculus exam, he paused, lowered his glasses, and stared at me. My blood ran cold. The silence wrapped tighter around my throat. "Interesting," he said, snapping the letter opener closed. "Honesty at last." Then he slid it across the desk with a deliberate scrape. After class, I crept back to the desk, curiosity a blade in my stomach. He'd left my confession, and beneath it, a second sheet. I unfolded it. "Did you know that shame is delicious? It's even better when shared. Will you taste more?" The script was unmistakably his. I shoved the paper into my bag and bolted out of the classroom. But the moment I reached the hallway, his voice drifted through the doorframe. "Mr. Evans," he called. I froze. "You have another story to tell." I stammered, "No, sir." My heart pounded so loud I was sure he could hear it. His voice softened. "Secrets can be appetites." Then the door clicked shut. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my house sounded like the chalkboard tapping. In my dreams, I sat at his desk as he read my hidden crimes, then pressed the chalk into my hand. The chalk bit through my skin, and crumbled into dust. I woke to find chalk smears across my palm. When I entered class the next morning, the blackboard was blank. He smiled at me, an odd flicker in his eyes that felt like an invitation. "Confession Day Part 2, he announced. "Write again." My fingers trembled as I filled a page. "I've lied to my friends about who I am. I'm not as happy as I pretend." I slid the envelope toward him, dreading what would come next. But before he could take it, the lights went out. Screeching thunder rattled the windows despite this being midday. In the sudden darkness, I heard the chalk rack scrape across the board. When the lights flickered back on, every line I'd written crawled across the blackboard in pale chalky letters larger than any handwriting I knew. He stood before it silent. Slowly, he traced each confession with his finger, turning the chalkboard into a gallery of shame. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. Then he turned, eyes glowing in the fluorescent light. "You see," he whispered, "chalk remembers. And he lifted the box of chalk. "I remember what it tells me." He snapped the chalk in half. The crack echoed like a gunshot. I bolted from the room, colliding with classmates, emerging from their own nightmares. I never returned to his class. Weeks later, I heard he'd vanished. His desk was gone, the blackboard scrubbed clean. The hallway vent no longer rattled, but sometimes at night I wake to the faintest scraping sound, like chalk against slate, and I wonder if Mr. Caldwell found a new class to haunt. If he's still collecting our secrets, one scribble at a time. I never believed that a teacher could leave a scent behind until Mr. Havelock arrived. It was the Monday before midterms, and the hallways at Adams Middle School smelled faintly of cafeteria pizza and disinfectant. When I pushed open the door to room 204, a new aroma greeted me. Something bittersweet, like old leather and decaying flowers. I hesitated in the doorway. He stood at the front sleeves, rolled up fingers, stained deep indigo. His shirt was pristine white, captive to the purple stains creeping across the cuffs. He looked at me with sharp, dark eyes that flicked over my face as though searching for a hidden bruise. There was an unsettling patience about him, a stillness that made the classroom feel like a mausoleum. "Good morning," he said, voice smooth as silk. "I'm Mr. Havelock, your new literature teacher." He pinched a fade of ink from his cuff and sniffed it thoughtfully. "I hope you'll appreciate the permanence of words." He told us to open our copies of Beowulf, but none of us had ever smelled ink like that. I passed around small inkwells, one per pair of students, and instructed us to dip our fingers and write our names on the first page. My fingertip trembled as I touched the cold, thick liquid. When I lifted it to the page, I saw my name glisten in a purple sheen, as though it were bleeding into the parchment. As the rest of the class wrote, I noticed a dark stain pooling around Mr. Havelock's desk, an inkwell overturned, but no one had knocked it. He moved toward me, sandals silent on the tile. "Names are the first stories," he whispered, eyes never leaving my hands. "Tell me yours true name." I stammered, "See, Christopher." He leaned over so close I could see the fine hairs on his arm. "Christopher," he repeated. "But what your parents intended," I swallowed. "Chris." He smiled thinly. "A poet's duty is to know every nuance." He dipped 2 fingers and traced a second name beneath mine, Bainbridge. It felt icy against the paper. Then he straightened, leaving me blinking at the double signature. All week, whispers followed me. Even in algebra, I caught the faint scent of ink, like he'd been there moments before. My pencil would nearly slip out of my hand, as though drawn by some unseen force. Every time I passed room 204, I saw the door crack slightly open, and the inkwell stain on the floor would widen, bleeding toward the hallway. On Friday, he announced our final project. We must transcribe a personal memory onto parchment using his ink. More than write, he said we must imbue the memory with ourselves. I felt the weight of it like an anchor. That night, I rummaged through my desk for a story worthy of ink so potent. Finally, I chose a memory from summer camp, how I'd watched fireflies drift across the lake under a starless sky. It was peaceful. I thought it would be safe. When I arrived Monday, Mr. Havelock handed each of us a pale parchment and a golden quill. The quills were twitchy, like they had minds of their own. I dipped the tip into the inkwell. The ink sank into the quill, like blood into a sponge. I hesitated, then began to write. I remember standing at the water's edge, breathing in the night. The fireflies glowed like lanterns in the dark, but the moment my pen touched the page, the quill shuddered. The letters spilled in sloppy streaks, blotting the parchment. I tried again, but the quill pressed harder, gouging the paper. In frustration, I flipped the page and wrote on the back, but the quill tore through the sheet altogether. Across the room, I heard Mr. Havelock humming soft, mournful. He glided toward me, an inkwell trailing behind him like a wounded pet. This ink, he murmured once, bound a poet's final testament. It demands sacrifice. He lifted my parchment. The firefly memory crawled across the page, shifting the fireflies, multiplied until the sky was aflame with them, their lights flickering like distant souls. Beneath the narrative, new words formed in an elegant hand, but the lake claimed them all, one by one. I jerked the parchment back. I didn't write that. He shrugged. Oh, but it's what you feel, isn't it? Loss, regret. His eyes softened. Give it breath. I stood and slammed my desk. The quill littered me with droplets of ink that burned on my skin. A pungent wave hit me, and I tasted metal in my mouth. I staggered backward. Around me, students were frozen quills suspended just above their papers. I realized then that we were all part of some gruesome tableau pinned by ink, forced to relive our hidden torments. Mr. Havelock raised his hand. The inkwell on my desk shook. It toppled, spilling ink that crawled across the floor, capillary thin lines seeking me. The ink snaked around my sneakers, climbing my legs. I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the humming. He whispered, "Embrace the story." Christopher, panic flared in me. I grabbed my memory and tore it into shreds, flinging the pieces away. The quill fell silent. The ink recoiled back into the inkwell, leaving the floor spotless. The humming stopped. He nodded slowly, as though approving. Very good. Truth is born in struggle. I grabbed my backpack and fled the room. In the hallway, every lock was sealed. I punched the door, rattled the handle, until finally it gave way. I ran down the corridor, the echo of his humming trailing me like a curse. I never returned to room 204 again. By the next week, Mr. Havelock was gone, no announcement, no forwarding address. The inkwells vanished, replaced by whiteboard markers. But I still found smudges of purple ink under my fingernails, and sometimes in the dead of night, I wake to a whisper. Tell me the story, Christopher. I keep a damp cloth by my bed, but the scent lingers, leather and decaying petals haunting my dreams, waiting for me to write again. I'll never forget the day Mrs. Marlowe showed up. It was a cold Wednesday in November, and Mrs. Gallagher, our chemistry teacher, had called in sick. The principal announced over the intercom, "Class of 11B, please welcome your substitute, Ms. Marlowe." Her name sounded rehearsed, as if she had practiced it under her breath. When I entered Lab 7, she stood alone by the fume hood, backlit by the harsh fluorescent glow. Her silhouette was slender, almost fragile, and she wore a crisp lab coat, buttoned all the way to her throat. But her eyes, those enormous glassy eyes, caught the light and held it reflecting mine back at me like dark pools of mercury. "Good morning," she said, voice soft and even. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Today, we will continue our study of titration curves." She gestured at the long row of beakers and barrettes. "Partner up." I ended up with Theo, the quiet kid who always smelled faintly of burnt toast. We followed her instructions carefully. Fill the burette with sodium hydroxide solution, place a few drops of phenolphthalein in the flask, and slowly add base until the solution just turned pink. Easy, except the moment I touched the glass stopcock, I felt a pulse beneath my fingertips, like the glass was alive, beating softly. When I looked up, Miss Marlowe was watching me, head tilted. The entire room felt silent, but for that heartbeat, and my heart thudded in my chest in time with it. I twisted the stopcock and let the liquid flow. The pink endpoint bloomed across the flask like spilled blood. Ms. Marlowe moved to my side. "Very good, Jonathan." Her voice floated in the air. "But is it precise?" She reached out and flicked a drop of the pink solution back into the burette with a long, pale fingertip. My breath caught. The pink instantly retreated, leaving the flask clear again. She tapped the flask. "Try again." Then she stepped back, her coat swishing like silk. I swallowed and reset the experiment. My hands trembled, but I added base, drop by drop. When the pink lingered for 30 seconds, exhaled. "Done." She smiled. "Perfect." She scribbled my name and score on the board, Jonathan H., 100%. At the bell, she dismissed us. As Theo and I packed our bags, I noticed her gaze flick to the open fume hood. Inside, the chemical waste jar sloshed with rainbow swirls. "Hey," I whispered, "you okay?" She turned, and for a heartbeat, her eyes went pitch black. No reflection, no light. Then she blinked, and they were glassy pools again. "Fine," she said, smoothing her lab coat. "Are you?" I shrugged. "Just cold." She smiled too wide and nodded. "See you tomorrow, Jonathan." I woke that night to the scent of chemicals, like ammonia and bleach, lingering in my room. My pillow smelled of phenolphthalein. My skin itched where the droplets had splashed tiny welts forming on my forearm. In a dream, I saw Ms. Marlowe leaning over me, with that empty smile, her eyes reflecting a swirling vortex of pink. The next morning, the hallways were still damp with condensation, and the air tasted metallic. I entered Lab 7 early, hoping to avoid her. But there she was, standing beside a locked glass cabinet. "Jonathan," she said as I passed. Her voice was softer this time, almost wistful. Then she cracked the cabinet door open. Inside were glass jars, each filled with a clear liquid. I recognized the label on one phenolphthalein, on another methyl orange. But the others had names I didn't know, strings of letters and numbers. She reached in and lifted one jar. No label, a viscous pink fluid sloshing inside. She traced a circle on the glass with her fingertip. "Colors are the language of the soul," she murmured. "But what if the soul speaks in shadows?" She set the jar back. "Your experiment today, find the shadow beneath the color." My stomach lurched. I joined Theo at our bench. On each pair of desks lay a single vial of unknown solution and a strip of pH paper. We were to test its acidity and record the hue shift. "Simple," he said. But as the class began, the walls of the lab closed and the cabinets looming like sentinels. When I dipped the strip into the vial, it turned black, an impossibility, since none of our reagents did that. The paper curled in my hand like a dying leaf. I looked up to show Theo, but his eyes were fixed on Ms. Marlowe. She nodded imperceptibly. I stared back at the strip. The blackness seeped into my vision, and suddenly I was no longer in the lab. I was in a vast empty void, the only light a faint phosphorescent glow from the strip. Beneath its glow, I saw shapes, hands reaching faces twisting in silent scream. A chorus of whispers echoed behind me. "Colors are lies. Shadows speak truth." I gasped and blinked. I was facing the lab bench again, and Miss Marlowe was beside me, gently taking the strip. She pressed it against a white tile. The blackness drained away, leaving only the pale pink tint. She handed it back. "Interesting result," she said, but I couldn't speak. My voice was trapped behind that void. She smiled kindly. "Don't worry, Jonathan. Some truths are too bright to see." I stashed the strip in my pocket, fled the room at the bell, and never looked back. That night, I found that vial of solution tucked under my pillow. The label read, "Shadow Extract." The liquid sloshed black as oil. When I tried to pour it out, it pooled on my desk, forming a perfect circle. Inside the circle, I saw my reflection eyes, wide, pupils dilated like Ms. Marlowe's. I threw the vial in the trash, but the next morning it was back on my desk empty. I opened the lid. A black vapor rose, curling around my wrist like a serpent. My skin itched, and I smelled bleach and lavender, her perfume. I haven't returned to Lab 7 since. Miss Marlowe was gone the next week, with no note, no explanation. The cabinet was empty. All jars vanished. But sometimes when the lights flicker in the chemistry wing, I swear I see her silhouette at the door. Her glassy eyes reflecting the glow of a single unseen flame, and the scent of chemicals that taints the air, whispering of colors and shadows, forever calling me back. I never should have borrowed Ms. Sinclair's notebook. It was the last day of 10th grade, and she'd finally handed back our final essays, tight-binding journals filled with our most earnest attempts at poetry and reflection. Mine lay on the desk beside hers, a pale blue, hardcover spiral-bound embossed with her name in curving silver letters. I asked if I could glimpse her critique before I left. She smiled so sweetly, it felt like a trap. "Of course," she said, flipping to a blank page at the very back. "Just promise you'll bring it back tomorrow." I nodded enthusiastically. In my haste to read her private annotations, teachable moments after all, I tucked it into my bag and sprinted home. That night, I set it on my desk and flipped to the end. Underneath her neat guideline, "Avoid cliches, speak your truth," I found words in a shaky scrawl. "Thank you for lending the journal. They'll love what you wrote. My heart stuttered. I didn't write anything there. I flipped pages backward. Every blank sheet had been filled with slanted handwriting. You were right to question Miss Caldwell's absence last week. Stop looking at me from the doorway. Your secret dread of assemblies is delicious. I slammed the notebook shut, and my legs went weak. I buried it beneath textbooks. Tomorrow I'd return it and pretend I'd never seen those lines. But that night, sleep betrayed me. In my dreams, I stood in the silent classroom. Desks were arranged in perfect rows. The overhead lights flickered. At the teacher's podium sat Mrs. Sinclair, her face hidden beneath long, dark hair. She rocked slowly, humming the opening to Greensleeves. When I stepped closer, her hair whipped aside, revealing eyes rimmed with black, empty sockets filled only with ink. She raised a finger and tapped her temple. Then she pointed to my chest. I looked down and saw my essay title burned into my shirt, Reflections of a Doubted Heart. Underneath ghostly ink bled lines of my deepest fears, lines I'd never written but knew intimately. I bolted upright in my bed, drenched in sweat. The notebook throbbed under my pillow, vibrating like a heartbeat. I yanked it out and flipped to the back. New words in a hand ever more frantic. You can't hide what you're afraid of. You're coming back tomorrow, aren't you? My blood ran cold. I hurled the journal across the room and curled into my covers. Morning light finally coaxed me to rise. At school, the hallways buzzed with end-of-year chaos. Lockers slamming farewells exchanged, summer looming. My stomach twisted as I approached room 112. The door was ajar. Inside, the desks were gone, and the floor was littered with abandoned journals, white, pink, green, every color imaginable. They formed a trail from the doorway to Ms. Sinclair's desk, where the pale blue notebook lay alone. I stepped in. The journals quivered as though alive. I knelt to pick mine up, but the others scattered away as if fleeing. I snatched the notebook and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. A hush fell. The overhead lights dimmed. In the silence, I heard pages flipping, though no wind stirred. I held my breath. Ms. Sinclair emerged from the shadows behind her desk, clasping her favorite pen. Her coat whispered across the floor. She looked at me with impossible calm. "Thank you for returning it," she said. She tapped the notebook. The cover sank in where her finger pressed as though it were flesh. I forced a nod. I'm sorry." She smiled and slid the notebook toward me. The ringlets of its spiral binding stretched toward my hand like eager fingers. My fingers brushed the coils, and the notebook locked itself closed with a metallic click that echoed like a gunshot. She leaned forward. "You read my private thoughts," she whispered. "Now, you'll help me fill the pages." I swallowed, but my mouth was dry. "I didn't mean to." She shook her head. "Everyone has something to say. Writers just need coaxing." She tapped the spine. "Here, write in mine." The notebook twitched. I looked down at Ms. Sinclair's pen. Its tip glistened black as though dipped in fresh ink. I felt compelled to take it. My hand rose without permission and uncapped the pen. "Write," she said. My eyes filled with tears, but I wrote on the front page, "Please let me leave." The pen screeched across the paper, forming the words in a cruel, jagged script. I looked up. Mrs. Sinclair's expression had softened just a fraction. "Good start," she murmured. She reached for her desk drawer, but didn't open it. Instead, she held up a single white sheet torn from another student's journal. "Now," she said, "tell me what you fear most." Panic surged, but I obeyed. The pen moved faster than my thoughts. "I fear that no one believes me, that I'm alone." I pressed down harder, and the ink bled through the page, staining the desk beneath. Each letter pulsed as I wrote like a heartbeat. When I finished, Mrs. Sinclair took the sheet and read it. Then she smiled truly. Smiled this time and set it atop the others in a stack. "Thank you," she said softly. "Now you're part of my collection." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Don't worry, you'll be back soon. We still have plenty to share." She closed the drawer and stood the journals on her desk perfectly aligned. She tipped her head. Class dismissed. The door clicked open. I ran before I could think, clutching the notebook. In the hallway, I dared to glance back. Through the classroom window, I saw her leaning over the journals, turning pages like she was reading a feast. I never saw Ms. Sinclair again after graduation. I graduated, went to college, moved across the country. I left that pale blue notebook behind in a dusty storage box where I hoped it would stay. But sometimes, late at night, I wake to the sound of pages rustling in the dark. And on my desk taped, where I'll see it, a single page torn from that notebook, with one sentence scrawled in midnight ink. "I'm coming for your story." I never thought I'd fear the music room until Mr. Langley took the podium. He arrived mid-semester, a tall man in a charcoal suit that hung too loosely, sleeves brushing the floor when he gestured. His face was long and gaunt jaw clenched, as though he were holding back some silent scream. When he spoke, his voice was a soft baritone that seemed to reverberate through the wood-paneled walls. "Good morning," he said, on his first day, lifting a conductor's baton with deliberate grace. "I am Mr. Langley, your band director." His eyes swept the room over the battered trumpets and warped drums until they settled on me. "And you," he nodded, "will play." We were a mediocre ensemble. At best, half the students never learned their parts, and the other half practiced idly on their phones. But from the moment he raised his baton, the air snapped tight. He tapped the stand 3 times, once for attention, once for readiness, and once for something else I couldn't name. That afternoon, he assigned each of us a solo passage to practice for Friday's rehearsal. I drew the clarinet part, a simple call and response motif in C minor. It was manageable. I left the room humming its melancholy melody, eager to prove myself. When I returned to the room later, the lights were dim. Mr. Langley stood motionless as I approached. The sheet music on my desk was stained with droplets of ink, like tears frozen on the page. He picked it up, smoothed the blotches, and handed it back. "Observe the gaps," he said softly. "Silence is as powerful as sound." I frowned but didn't argue. I practiced the notes as written, pausing where the ink had pooled. When I played during rehearsal, the band sputtered at the silent measures. Curious glances passed among the percussionists. Mr. Langley halted us. "Clarity," he said, voice echoing. "Precision. Silence must be embraced." He tapped his baton, and we began again. The hollow spaces tasted like ash on my tongue, but I complied. After class, I lingered to ask about the rainwater spots on the ceiling tiles. He smiled, a twitch so slight I almost missed it. "Our instruments must echo the world around us," he said. "Even the sky weeps." By Friday, our piece took on a new shape. Jagged pauses, off-kilter rhythms, and haunting emptiness where melodies should soar. I realized with sudden dread that what we practiced no longer resembled any song I knew. It was a dirge. That evening, anxiety gnawed at me. I couldn't sleep hearing the muted brass and staccato silences looping in my skull. In my dreams, Mr. Langley stood on the podium, surrounded by sheet music, fluttering like dead moths. He raised his baton. Instead of guiding us, he plunged it into the air, gouging black lines of silence across the score. I jolted awake to the scraping of wood. My clarinet stood on its case reed, removed the pages splayed around it as though in mourning. I reached for the nearest sheet. It was my clarinet line scrawled in spidery ink. This time, play the rest, or face the silence. I dropped the paper. The lights clicked on by themselves, revealing Mr. Langley in the doorway, arms folded. His gaze held mine unblinking. "You accepted silence," he said. "Now, accept consequence." He pointed to an empty stool. "Sit." I obeyed, dread coiling in my gut. He slipped in beside me, taking the baton in his thin hand. The room fell into heavy quiet so thick I felt crushed. "Play," he said. I raised the clarinet, fingers trembling. My lungs stung as I forced air through the instrument. The first note was pure, but before I could continue, he tapped the baton, twice long, deliberate taps. The sound snapped off, midstream, swallowed by nothing. I coughed, startled by the abrupt cutoff. He leaned in, voice low. "Silence is not absence. It is presence, unyielding. Learn to hear it." He pressed the baton against the bell of my clarinet. When I played again, the tone warbled like a voice strangled beneath thick cloth. Again. He withdrew the baton, the warped echo lingering. I played the full passage, gaps intact. At the final rest, I expected applause or relief. Instead, he tilted his head and smiled. "Exquisite." He closed his eyes, breathing in a slow rhythm, yet incomplete. The conductor, too, must play. I blinked. He handed me the baton. Confused, I held it weightless as a feather. His eyes stayed closed. Conduct. My pulse thundered. I drew a trembling breath and waved the baton in the air. The score on the stand rustled, pages turning on their own to join my waiting hands. The band materialized in the gloom, each instrument floating, no players in sight. The tuba sighed with a ragged breath, the flute shivered at its pitch, and the drums thumped without a drummer. I conducted, my arms rigid with fear. The phantom orchestra played hollow, discordant notes that rattled the windows and skittered across the floor. I tried to stop, but the baton compelled me onward. The music swelled into a choral of shadows, each pause echoing like a scream. Suddenly, Mr. Langley's voice cut through the cacophony. Silence now. I obeyed, lowering my arms. The phantom instruments froze mid-note. The room darkened, and I heard something scuttle behind me. A clarinet reed fell at my feet, splintered. I turned to Mr. Langley, only he was gone. In his place, the podium stood empty. The baton balanced on its edge, quivering. I backed away. The lights flickered once, then died, plunging me into absolute darkness. The last thing I felt was the baton's tip grazing my palm, sending a cold shock up my arm. When the lights returned, I was alone. The band hadn't returned. The room was empty, but for my trembling hands and the lone baton on the podium. I haven't been back to the music room since. I dropped the baton in the lake behind the school, but late at night, I still hear echoing notes drifting on the breeze, discordant, hollowed-out tunes carried by silence. And sometimes, when the wind dies, I swear I see a tall figure in a charcoal suit standing by the shore, baton raised, waiting for me to conduct the final, silent movement. I always loved geometry, the symmetry, the logic of angles, but nothing in Euclid prepared me for Mr. Selwyn's class. He arrived the first week of spring semester, wearing a crisp charcoal vest over a white dress shirt and carrying an antique wooden ruler that gleamed unnaturally under the fluorescence. His eyes were sharp as compasses, narrowing at any student who erred in a proof. He introduced himself quietly. "I'm Mr. Selwyn, your geometry teacher. In this room, every line has purpose, every angle, intention." He tapped the ruler against the blackboard, and the echo reverberated through my spine like a warning. Our first assignment was straightforward: prove that the base angles of an isosceles triangle are equal. But when I approached his desk to hand it in, I found the ruler placed across my paper, nibbling at the edges of my diagram. It sliced through the ink, carving new lines into the graphite so that my neat 45-degree angles curved into something grotesque and uneven. He looked up, eyes glinting. "Interesting modification," he said, lifting the ruler and letting it snap shut like a predatory jaw. "You see, proof is never complete until it reflects truth." That afternoon, I inspected my work. The triangle's sides were still equal, but the base angles hunched inward like bent limbs. I tried to erase the stray lines, but they deepened into the paper unerasable. I shoved the worksheet into my binder, unease curdling in my gut. Over the next week, every geometric figure I drew took on a life of its own. Parallelograms, skewed circles, ellipsed into ovals, and right angles sharpened into cruel hooks. When I pointed it out to Mr. Selwyn, he nodded sagely. "Geometry is the shape of reality," he murmured. "When your reality shifts, so must the shapes." On Friday, he assigned a special project: construct a three-dimensional model of any polygonal shape using cardboard glue and the noteworthy addition mirrors. We were to assemble the facets so the mirrors faced inward, reflecting the interior angles infinitely. I chose a regular dodecahedron, 12 faces each, a perfect pentagon. I spent Saturday cutting and folding, measuring every edge with meticulous care. As I worked, I felt an uncanny sensation, like clay shifting under my fingers. When I finally placed the last face, I peered into the mirrored interior. Instead of 12 reflected pentagons, I saw shadows, dozens of crooked, misshapen shapes that twisted away from the true geometry. I pressed my face closer. The reflections flickered, resolving into my own eyes, wide, frantic, and unreal. Behind me, I sensed movement. When I spun around, the room was empty. Monday morning, I carried the dodecahedron into class. Students set down their models, cubes, octahedrons, even a icosahedron. But every mirrored interior held the same warped geometry as mine. We arranged them on desks, forming a metallic constellation under Mr. Selwyn's gaze. He circled the room, pausing at each model. He tapped them with his ruler. Each tap produced a dissonant chime, like glass failing to ring properly. When he reached mine, the ruler cracked one mirror, sending a spiderweb of fractures across its surface. I flinched, but he merely smiled. "Excellent," he whispered. "You've exposed the flaw. Now show me the correction." My throat tightened. I'd already built it perfectly. What correction could he want? He handed me a new mirror fragment, thin, dark, and oddly warm to the touch. "Replace that piece and observe," he said. "Geometry demands balance." My hands shook as I pried out the broken mirror and fitted the new one in its place. It clicked seamlessly. I peered into the interior again, and the reflections shifted. The crooked shapes were gone, replaced by infinite versions of the perfect pentagon. But behind each one, just beyond the glimmer, I glimpsed a shadow. A slender figure with the same charcoal vest, an antique ruler, its face obscured by darkness, watching me from countless mirrored angles. I recoiled, and the model clattered to the desk. Mr. Selwyn was beside me, in an instant lifting it gently. He held it to the light. "Geometry reveals your true form," he said. "Now you understand." The bell rang, but no one moved. The classroom was silent, except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, one I'd never noticed before, its hands rotating at impossible speed. I gathered my things and fled the room, leaving the models behind. In the hallway, my breath came in ragged gasps. I dared to look back through the open door. I saw Mr. Selwyn standing amidst the reflected shapes, his ruler raised like a conductor's baton. The infinite shadows in the dodecahedron's mirrors bent toward him, swirling around his feet. I never returned to his class. By the next week, a new teacher stood at the blackboard, Mr. Fuller, who wore a patterned sweater vest and handed out simple worksheets on parallel lines and transversals. Geometry regained its comforting order until the day I pulled open a drawer in my desk and found a single shard of mirror etched with a pentagonal outline. The edges were warm. At night, I dream of that dodecahedron, its mirrors reflecting countless versions of myself interlaced with shadows. And sometimes, when I stand in front of a mirror, I see just beyond my reflection the dark silhouette of Mr. Selwyn, ruler in hand, tracing crooked lines into my eyes, reshaping the angles of my soul. I first noticed something was off in Ms. Wendell's art room on a stormy Tuesday afternoon. The windows rattled under the gusts, and the scent of turpentine and wet clay hung heavy in the air. I'd stayed after school to finish a charcoal sketch of the old oak behind the gym, chasing the play of shadow and light. When I looked up, Ms. Wendell was standing at the back of the room, arms folded, staring at the wall of student portraits. She usually left right at the bell, but today, her heels clicked on the paint-spattered floor. I frowned. "Almost done?" she asked, voice soft as velvet. I nodded, not taking my eyes off the portraits. In every frame, dozens of them, students caught in mid-expression, surprised, amused, bored. But now, they seemed alive. Their eyes, drawn in dark graphite, glinted in the dim light like wet marbles. "Lovely," she murmured. "Such honest faces." I turned back to my sketch. "Thanks." My pencil scratched across the paper, but my hand was shaking. She drifted forward, examining my oak tree. Rain splattered against the tall windows. "A portrait," she said, suddenly gesturing at the line work. "But of what?" I paused. "Well, a tree isn't a person." I smiled nervously. "I guess it's more of a study in contrast." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "Everything is a portrait," she whispered. "Everything has a face to reveal." I frowned, concerned. "I have to get this done before my art club meeting." I grabbed my sketchbook. Her lips curved into a small smile, too small. "Take your time," she said. "I'll be here." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying her words. Everything has a face. In my dreams, the oak tree morphed into a twisted figure, its branches writhing like arms, its hollow knot like a gaping eye. The next day, I dared myself to return. The art room was empty when I arrived. The portraits on the wall seemed unchanged, except each gaze now followed me as I walked past. I caught one student's eyes flick sideways as though tracking my movement. My pulse quickened. Ms. Wendell slid into the doorway behind me. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was cheerful, but her eyes, they glittered with something predatory. I swallowed. "Morning." I stepped around her to set down my bag. She pointed to an empty easel. "New assignment," she announced. "Self-portrait using mixed media." I blinked. We already did that in September. She shook her head. A true self-portrait. She tapped the easel. Paint how you see yourself. My stomach twisted. I had no idea how I saw myself. But she gestured for me to begin. I mixed charcoal ash from yesterday's incense and thin washes of acrylic. As I worked, she circled the room, whispering tips to other students. Let the paint drip where your heart aches. Blend the edges where you hide. I felt exposed. Hours later, I stepped back. On the canvas was a blurred figure, my silhouette face obscured in shadow. One hand over my heart, the other stretched outward. The background bled from deep crimson into stark white. It looked anguished. I turned to Ms. Wendell. Her eyes bore into me. Beautiful, she murmured. Now sign it. I hesitated. Then I scrawled my name in black ink. The moment I did, the paint in the silhouette's hand smudged wet viscous, spreading a smear of red toward the edge of the canvas. Perfect, she breathed. She lifted the portrait and hung it on the wall among the others. My knees went weak. I watched as the silhouette on my canvas shifted. It turned its head, slightly facing me. Its shadowed face puckered like it was testing lips it didn't have. I backed away. Can I leave now? She followed me to the door. We'll continue tomorrow, she said. You'll see the portrait evolves. I hurried down the hall and never stayed late again. That night, I lay petrified in bed. At 2:13 a.m., I smelled paint, acrylic, and ash lingering in my room. I dared to lift my head in the faint moonlight through my window. I saw a pale glow on my desk. There my sketchbook lay open to a blank page, but streaked with red. Footprints, tiny charcoal black and dripping, led across the page, stopping where a crude sketch had appeared. My self-portrait, hand extended, beckoning me. My heart thundered. I jumped up and flipped the page. The next blank sheet bore a new image. Ms. Wendell's reflection staring back at me. Her hair was wild, her eyes hollow pits. At her throat, a black heart dripping ash and ink. I screamed, ripping the sketchbook shut. The dark shapes on the cover writhed as though alive. I hurled it under my bed and collapsed in tears, too terrified to move. In the morning, I confessed to my parents and begged them to let me avoid art class. They thought I was anxious. I forced a smile and trudged to school. During class, Ms. Wendell stood before the wall of portraits. She ran a fingertip along each frame. Every portrait needs a witness, she said, voice echoing strangely. I forced myself to look at mine. It hung in the center-shadowed face, turned outward. The crimson background seemed darker today. The silhouette's hand no longer reached outward. It curled into a fist. Beneath it, in fresh charcoal smudges, I saw words I hadn't drawn. Soon, Ms. Wendell turned and caught me staring. She smiled. "See you tomorrow," she whispered. My blood ran cold. I thought I knew every corner of Lincoln High, every locker-lined corridor, every dusty classroom, until I met Dr. Grostarashwani. He arrived 3 days before finals, introduced as a substitute for the calculus teacher who'd fallen ill. His coat was charcoal wool buttons of dull pewter, and he carried a leather briefcase worn smooth by age. But what unnerved me were his eyes. One storm gray, one amber, each ringed with faint red veins. On his first day, the intercom crackled, "Room 309. Dr. Corwin." The number seemed to glow in my mind. 3 plus 0 plus 9 equals 12. The number of final exams I would take next week. I shook off the feeling. It was just coincidence, I told myself. as I climbed the creaking stairs. The door to room 309 was ajar. I pushed it open. Inside, the desks faced a solitary podium. The chalkboard was scrubbed white. Dr. Corwin stood motionless by the window, arms folded. He turned, and the room chilled. "Good afternoon," he said, voice deep and layered like distant thunder. He unbuttoned his coat, revealing a plain white shirt stained faintly with ink. "I'm here to ensure you pass." He handed out sheets of paper. No problems printed, just blank margins and a header, "Final lesson." Beneath it, in tiny script, were 3 words, "Write your score." I glanced at my classmates. They stared back blankly, pencils in hand. I opened the paper. It was unlike any exam I'd seen. No equations, no prompts, only the title and a strange symbol in the corner, a circle bisected by a jagged line. "Begin," he said, raising a slender finger. I wrote my name at the top. Beneath it, I put today's date. Then I paused. How could I write my score if there were no questions? Dr. Corwin's storm gray eye flicked to me. "Continue." I forced my pencil across the page 100%. I hesitated, then underlined it twice. "No." His amber eye glittered. "Your true score." My heart pounded. I erased and tried again, 80%. I could almost feel the ink cool on the paper. He frowned. "Still not enough." I trembled. 50%. I scribbled, voice barely audible. He shook his head and stepped forward, boots quiet on the tile. "Mathematics is the language of reality. Reality does not lie." He tapped the paper with his pewter button. Each tap reverberated in my skull. I closed my eyes. The seconds stretched. Finally, I scrawled, "Represent my shame at failing to understand left-hand derivatives, my dread of not graduating." Dr. Corwin's mouth curved. "Accepted." He took the paper and slipped it into his briefcase. Then he opened a handbook from its interior pocket. Worn brown leather pages yellowed. He flipped to an entry labeled "Reassessment." He closed the briefcase and set it on the podium. Turning, he surveyed the class. "We will finish what was begun." He tapped the chalkboard, and the blank slate groaned as if under pressure. Suddenly, equations scrawled themselves across the surface. Differential operators, limits, integrals, problems I recognized from our semester. But each one twisted into impossible forms. Symbols, overlapped functions nested within themselves ad infinitum. He waved his hand, and the desks rustled as our exam sheets floated up, circling the room like startled birds. Each sheet flipped open to reveal new problems, inscribed in angry red problems we hadn't learned that defied logic. "Begin," he commanded. My pencil hovered. Fear clenched my chest. If reality did not lie, and I had declared myself 0%, then how could I solve these? My classmates bent to work, frantically writing. I stared, paralyzed, as the clock on the wall unspooled. The hands spun backward, then forward, the minute chime echoing like a death knell. Dr. Corwin glided among us, peering at our work. He nodded at some, shook his head at others. Whenever he passed, I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, as though his amber eye reached out and stamped my spine with judgment. I closed my eyes and tried to recall a rule. The derivative of secant is secant times tangent, but the symbols on my paper blurred. I opened my eyes and saw shapes shifting, integral signs elongating into serpents, numbers fracturing into slashes. Time slipped away. My classmates' pencils scratched ceaselessly. Dr. Corwin never wrote, only watched. Then, with a sudden gust, The papers snapped to the podium. We looked up breathless. "Time," he said. The clock's hands halted at an impossible hour, 13:37. He opened his briefcase again and retrieved our sheets. One by one, he read off names and scores in that layered voice. Some students walked out, faces flushed or ashen, clutching their papers. Each had a number beside their name, some high, some low. When he reached me, he cleared his throat. "Jonathan Klein, 0%. I gripped my desk, but he raised a hand. Silence. He laid my paper on the podium and replaced it with a thick booklet titled Supplemental Education. Its cover was embossed with the same jagged circle symbol. He closed the briefcase and pocketed the booklet. "Your final lesson awaits." He swept from the room and the door clicked shut. My hands shook as I opened the booklet. Inside were rules and theorems I'd never heard proofs written in a font that crawled across the page. On the back cover, in the same tiny script, "Return upon completion." I looked up at the door. It was locked. I stood advanced to the podium and began to read aloud. Definition 1.1. A knowledge deficit is the absence of understanding. A voice echoed behind me, soft yet omnipresent, "Rectify it." I spun around. The room was empty. The chalkboard equations faded to white. The clock resumed its normal forward tick. My own voice startled me. Proof 1.1. Let X represent. I lowered my voice, heart pounding. I was stuck in this room, in this lesson, until I completed the booklet. Only then would Dr. Corwin release me. And if reality did not lie, if the score I chose was my true measure, then I was condemned to 0% until I learned the final lesson he demanded. I pressed my palm to the door. It was solid steel. So I sit here now, in room 309, reading and writing, the clock ticking in my ears. I've come to understand the calculus of fear. Its limit approaches. Terror, its derivative, becomes despair. I pause, only when the intercom crackles. Room 309, Dr. Corwin. But the message never continues, hanging in the stale air like a question. I'm writing this in the margins of the booklet. My name, the date, my plea. Release me. If you ever find this notebook, beware the final lesson. For Dr. Corwin ensures that every student passes, eventually. And once you write your true score, there is no turning back. Hello everyone, I'm ZiBo, and thank you so much for watching until the very end of this video. I truly hope today's stories brought you some enjoyable moments. If you found them helpful, don't forget to leave a comment down below. Every bit of your feedback helps me improve and continue creating quality content. See you in the next video.